Out of all the traitor Primarchs that would eventually become demons, the one that has never really sat right with the community has been Perturabo, the Lord of Iron himself, Primarch of the Iron Warriors. You see, these Chaos Space Marines stand apart from their traitorous brethren in that they actively seem to hate everything about chaos. They ritualistically cut off any mutation that forms on their body, and they scorn the use of witchcraft and demons, instead choosing to bring death to their enemies in the form of brutal siege warfare. Whereas Perturabo's brothers were emotional and indulgent, he himself was cold and logical. He was a strategic genius, a master of warfare in all its forms, and an individual that prided himself on his labyrinthian intellect. But most importantly, he looked down on his brothers who allowed themselves to become puppets of the Chaos Gods. Despite everything I just told you, the lore has confirmed that the Lord of Iron himself is in fact a demon. But how did this happen? What led him down the path to demonhood? And most importantly, why did he do it? Well, today we're going to get to the bottom of that and a whole lot more, as we try to figure out exactly how the Lord of Iron became a demon Primarch. But before we get started, I wanted to take a minute to give a huge thank you to the sponsor of this video, Into the AM. And not only have they been a huge supporter of this channel for over a year now, but more importantly, they make some of the best graphic t-shirts that you can buy on the internet. They're also always coming out with new, flashy, and vibrant designs, printed on super high quality and incredibly comfortable shirts. These things have been my go-to everyday t-shirts for about a year now, and I can honestly say I couldn't be happier with them. They're hands down the comfiest shirts that I own, and in addition to being high quality and super soft as well as shrink resistant, they also haven't faded no matter how many times I send them through the wash, which as a person who is super into graphic tees, that's really hard to find. With all graphic tees though, I tend to flip them inside out before I wash them and then use cold water. I find the designs last a lot longer doing it that way. Their shirts are stylish, comfy, and above all else, super reasonably priced. I can get a bundle of 3 of their graphic tees for only $61.95, or 3 of their basic tees for only $52.95. And then on top of that, you can save an additional 10% off your entire order by using the link in the description of this video. Again, use the link in the description of this video or code Weshammer at checkout to get 10% off your entire order. Big thanks to Into the AM for sponsoring this video.
Perturabo's ascension into a demonic Primarch would come shortly after the traitors were pushed back at the Siege of Terra. Their defeat was followed up by an event known as the Scouring, wherein the Loyalists launched a bloody and vengeful crusade to hunt down every last traitor, dismantle their empire, and push the survivors into exile within the Eye of Terror. The Imperial Fists and the Iron Warriors had always been hated rivals, even before the Horus Heresy fully got underway. You see, the Iron Warriors viewed the Fists as a bunch of pompous glory hounds. They got all the best assignments, wherein the Iron Warriors were sent down into the trenches, deep into the muck and grime to fight the real wars. Their history and great deeds never truly appreciated, whereas the Fists were celebrated as true heroes of the Imperium. During the Scouring, the Fists would go to work tearing down all of the fortresses the Iron Warriors had established on different worlds throughout the galaxy. Now, this would come to a head on the world of Sebastus IV, where the Lord of Iron himself would end up laying a trap for the Imperial Fist Primarch Rogol Dorn. It's important to know that despite the fact that most of the legions would have some role to play at the Siege of Terra, the reality was that it was mostly Perturabo versus Dorn, the Praetorian of Terra's faultless bastions versus the Lord of Iron's master siegecraft. I absolutely love the Siege of Terra novels, but for anyone listening who's also a big fan of those books, come on, we can admit that it's mostly the Perty and Dorn show. Anyways, Perturabo, however, would have his vengeance, and this would come in the form of one of his most prized creations, the Eternal Fortress. The message that he had laid a trap for the Imperial Fists was intentionally allowed to leak back to the Loyalist forces, and after the message reached Dorn, he publicly declared that he and his sons would dig his traitorous brother out of his hole and drag him back to Terra in an iron cage, hence the origin of the preceding battle's name in Imperial records. Rabute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, could immediately tell that something was wrong. He pleaded with his brother to let him and the Sons of Ultramar assist him, that Perturabo was far too clever to let his plans be intentionally known like that. Dorn was never one to underestimate an enemy, though his hatred for what his brother had orchestrated on Terra had certainly clouded his judgment. Him and his sons were more than capable of bringing Perturabo to justice, And moreover, they perhaps believed they needed to do it alone in order to atone for some perceived mistake and not having put a stop to the Iron Warriors so many years ago. The Eternal Fortress itself was an incredibly sophisticated piece of engineering, a single keep that sat in the middle of 20 square miles of bunkers, towers, minefields, trenches, razor wire, and tank traps, designed in such a way that it represented the 8-pointed star that had commonly been associated with the Chaos Legions. And I know what you're thinking, 20 miles of defense around a single fortress definitely makes it sound like it would be quite a task to take it. And that's certainly true. But here's the thing about the Eternal Fortress and Perturabo's deceptive genius. From Perturabo's perspective, fortresses by their very nature are limited in their practicality because they're designed to protect something. This is something that the enemy can take advantage of and limits the options available to the inhabitants of said fortress when forced to respond to the aggressor's actions. With the Eternal Fortress, however, the keep at its center was a purposeless distraction. It existed only as a decoy and served no strategic importance to the Iron Warriors. Instead, deep beneath that 8-pointed star were a series of underground tunnels that connected all of the surface's fortifications. Furthermore, each of its entrances were concealed to obscure its true purpose. The reality of the Eternal Fortress was that it existed solely as 20 square miles of killing ground. It was in those underground tunnels that Perturabo and his sons waited for the Imperial Fist to arrive and open up with an orbital bombardment. Sure enough, the Sons of Dorn would take the bait. And as soon as they did, the Iron Warriors brought online dozens of remote weapon silos that were located far away from the fortress itself. The Imperial Fists would respond by launching a wave of Thunderhawks, each one full of Marines to attack the silos, while the rest of the Legion would initiate a combat drop led by Rogel Dorn himself. The Eternal Fortress was not a singular trap, it was traps within traps within traps. And so too did the silos play an important role in the labyrinthian plots and calculations of the Lord of Iron. As the Thunderhawks engaged them, the huge amount of missiles that had been stockpiled within the silos were remotely detonated. Not only did this obliterate all of the Thunderhawks that were within range, but it hurled thousands of tons of debris into the planet's atmosphere, subsequently blocking all communication between the ground troops and the Imperial Fist fleet in orbit. The percussion of explosions served as the Iron Warriors' rallying cry. Their soldiers crawled out of their underground tunnels, and the previously obscured Iron Warriors' fleet surged forward to engage the Loyalists. For the most part, both of the fleets were equally matched in terms of size and firepower. The Fists, however, had one major disadvantage. They had deployed all of their Thunderhawks to the surface, as well as most of their Marines. The Iron Warriors' fleet, on the other hand, was bristling with assault boats, full of traitors eager to spill blood. It only took a couple of hours, but eventually, the Loyalist fleet was pushed dangerously out of position. Well, the only targets being engaged on the planet's surface were done so at coordinates that were all by the Lord of Iron's design. He watched from the balcony of one of his spires, seeing each unit systematically destroyed by his exact calculations. Realizing that they weren't going to be receiving much support from their ships in orbit, the Imperial Fists would proceed with the assault in parade ground formation on a 4-company front. The traitors' first line of defense was the minefields, which did their work to soften up the first few waves. Then when the Imperial Fists eventually managed to move past them, they found their way halted once again by a line of fortifications. They realized their vehicles weren't going to be able to move past them until they were destroyed. The Iron Warriors, however, were there waiting for them in a vast series of trenches. They opened up with volleys of bolter fire and heavy weapon systems to keep the invaders pinned in place, while even more Iron Warriors emerged from underground bunkers behind the enemy, charging in with crack grenades and melta charges to destroy the stalled vehicles. The Loyalists found themselves attacked on all sides, pinned between the tank traps. They turned back to face the newcomers, and eventually were able to rally, breaking away from them and moving forward into the Iron Warriors' trenches. However, when they finally got there, they found them all mysteriously empty. It continued on this way throughout the fight, Perturabo dissecting the Imperial Fists, tank by tank, squad by squad. Despite the setbacks, Rogel Dorn was convinced that the Imperial Fist would claim victory this day, and continued to push his men onwards, whereas Perturabo instead pulled back some of his defenders and left the majority to hold, a strategy that was fundamentally designed to break the Imperial Fist into ever smaller groups. By the 6th day, it was said that pretty much every single warrior was at this point fighting alone, and the forces of Dorn had been forced to burrow into the mud and piling up of their brothers' corpses for cover. The Lord of Iron patiently allowed the battle to continue, savoring every moment of his brother's imminent defeat. He would allow him to rampage around through the trenches, calling his name and demanding he come out and face him. with no intention of obliging their request. Instead, Rogal Dorn's desperation and erratic behavior would further demoralize the remaining Imperial fists. The battle would drag on like this for another 3 grueling weeks, and at this point, the planet-side Imperial fists were so deeply entrenched within the killing zone that escape had become an impossibility. The Imperial Fist captains called for a breakout, but Rogal Dorn refused. He contended that his brother was incapable of defeating him, and thus called for one final charge. Despite the hopelessness of the situation, Dorn's sons would never abandon him, and were fully prepared to die that day alongside their gene-sire. On the Iron Warrior side, however, everything seemed to be going according to plan. Perturabo's traps had been successfully sprung one after the other, and at this point, victory was certainly assured. However, this is perhaps where the Lord of Iron's greatest weakness comes into play. Despite his confidence in himself, he had never been able to beat Dorn. Not in the Horus Heresy, not at the Siege of Terra, and not even when they were younger playing Regicide together. He was never able to claim true victory, and always existed in his brother's shadow. But this time was different. He knew he had finally bested him. He was so sure of himself, so thoroughly convinced that he had finally trapped Dorn in an impossible scenario, that he was incapable of just ending it. Having stood in Dorn's shadow for so long, and having constantly been overlooked and not shown the proper respect his strategic genius should have commanded, he had grown a disturbing fascination with tormenting his enemies. He easily could have finished them off at any time, but he continued to choose not to. This would ultimately prove to be his downfall, as even though in the beginning of this story, Dorn had refused Guilliman's help, the Lord of Ultramar had chosen to put the Imperium before pride, ignoring his brother's orders and coming to the rescue with a full Ultramarine fleet. The Ultramarines' Thunderhawks plunged through the dust clouds to evacuate the wounded Imperial fists and wreak havoc on the Iron Warriors. Now, Perturabo was in no position to be fighting off 2 legions, and instead turned his full attention to preventing the Imperial fists from evacuating any of their dead and wounded. The fists obviously didn't want to leave any of them behind, but prioritized the warriors that were still capable of fighting, and thus had a higher likelihood of escaping with their lives. This was undoubtedly a huge loss for Rogal Dorn. He fully acknowledged that if it hadn't been for Guilliman ignoring his orders, he would have gotten himself and all of his sons killed. They left behind 400 Marines at the Eternal Fortress that day, and it would be 19 years before the Imperial Fist could once again go to war. Even to this day, their failure at Sebastius IV haunts the Legion as a mark of shame. Even though the Iron Warriors were eventually pushed back by the Ultramarines, forced to abandon the planet, and walked away without Dorn's head, Perturabo managed to gain a secondary prize that perhaps had been his true goal all along. You see, there's a very good reason for why the Iron Warriors were so fiercely fighting to not let the Imperial Fist take back their dead and wounded, as before they retreated, they would gather all of them up, and then at a later time, after having executed any that still lived, all of the gene seed from these fallen Imperial Fists would be harvested and used in a demonic ritual, sacrificed as payment to bring about an unholy apotheosis in their Primarch. He was deemed a deserving and faithful servant of the Pantheon, and elevated into a demonic champion. With the Battle of the Iron Cage coming to a close, Perturabo had finally settled the score with his pompous brother that had been long overdue. However, over the course of his career, he had been wronged many times. Just because one of those had finally been set right did not mean his crusade of vengeance had come to a close. He now set his sights even higher, and had every intention of settling the score with a very particular corpse on the Golden Throne. So if you know anything about Perturabo, the Iron Warriors, and the nature of the Traitor Legions, it's that out of all of the Chaos Legions, they're probably the main ones that have the least tolerance for chaos bullshit. They actively and ritualistically cut off any mutation that forms on their body, and tend to not utilize demons or witchcraft in their engagements. They don't like things that are unpredictable. They want to mathematically make sure their victory is inevitable. Now don't get me wrong, they are absolutely brutal. Just that brutality tends to come in the form of sending waves of thousands of mortal slaves through a minefield in order to clear it, as opposed to just using warp sorcery to remove obstacles. The warp by its very nature is chaotic and unpredictable, and the more demons and warriors drunk on the promises of dark gods get involved, the more all the variables of warfare become harder and harder to calculate. Perturabo is a man that prides himself on his overwhelming strategic genius, and would never want to win a battle if it meant utilizing some kind of Deus Ex Chaos Machina. He wants his enemies to know that he's better than them, that he's smarter than them, and that they are fully made aware of their grave error in challenging his labyrinthian genius. On the surface, out of all of the Chaos Primarchs to become demons, Perturabo seems to make the least amount of sense. And this is a sentiment that's been echoed within the community for a long time. But is it actually true? To figure that out, we can examine a few key moments throughout Purdy's journey in the Horus Heresy and beyond that better explain his ascent into demonhood. First and foremost, we have this passage from the novel The Lost and the Damned that takes place during the Siege of Terra. Perturabo is aboard the Vengeful Spirit, and he thinks about himself, his brothers, and the Warp. Already a master of the material sciences, he coveted the power of the Warp. He saw possibilities beyond anything his genius could accomplish were it to remain shackled to the materium. But he was wary. His investigations were thorough. He would not follow his brothers into damnation and throw himself blindly upon the mercies of the gods, but circumvent them altogether and become a god himself. As he proceeded through the vessel, his armor's autosenses recorded everything for later examination. The Vengeful Spirit was a living textbook on how not to grasp the Warp's might. In every way, it had changed for the worse. The taint of mutation lay on all things. And Perturabo deeply disapproved. The Warp was chaos. If approached carelessly, it was uncontrollable. He prized order. He would impose order upon chaos, where his brothers had not. In securing his own apotheosis, Fulgrim had tricked Perturabo, but ultimately, like Angron, he had become a puppet of his passions. Magnus had chosen the esoteric path and fallen from it. Mortarion had been humbled. Lorgar was abandoned by the creatures he had unleashed. These things would not happen to him, for he was Perturabo. He was logical when the others were impulsive, methodical when they were rash, passionless when they were indulgent. He was the Lord of Iron, and he was better than them all. This is the mindset that Perturabo had at the time of the Siege of Terra, and it demonstrates that he saw value in the Warp. He is, however, incredibly cautious of it, and realizes that it would take someone of supreme genius in order to bend it to their will, something that his brothers were not capable of. Whether he is ultimately right or wrong here is ultimately unimportant, as this passage simply exists to give us context into why he would choose to ascend to demonhood. There's a lot of variables in how he became a demon that we still don't really understand, and hopefully those will be made a lot clearer in the future when Games Workshop inevitably decides to bring him back to the tabletop game. But I think it's clear from this passage that the idea that Perturabo would never allow himself to become a demon only makes sense on the surface level. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that I firmly believe that if he believed he could exert his control and dominance over chaos, then he would certainly do that. More recently, there have been 2 short stories released wherein the Iron Warrior known as Hansu speaks with the now ascended Perturabo, giving us a bit more insight into his mindset in the modern era. I'm gonna let you know right now that Games Workshop, in their infinite wisdom, decided to make these 2 short stories exclusive to the re-release of Storm of Iron in its collector's edition, a book that is ridiculously hard to find, and if you do manage to find a copy, it carries an enormous price tag. When I make these videos, I rely almost exclusively on primary sources in order to validate the things that I think I know. However, in this particular scenario, I have to rely on summaries that other people have provided online, as I think these 2 short stories do provide a lot of context to Perturabo and being a demon. First and foremost, we have a quick passage that tells us what he looks like after he became a demon Primarch. Even before his elevation into demonhood, the Primarch had been colossal, but now he was a giant plated in silver and steel, encased in armor that was more a fortified sarcophagus than anything wrought for a living being. Edged in yellow and black, scarred from 10,000 wars, and seamed with weld line-like scars. It was known as the Logos, its texture strangely alive, like a skin of metal and flesh combined. He went without helm, his head a nightmare of pallid dead flesh, necrotic and bleached of color, like a corpse dragged from a depthless ocean trench. Thick cords of ribbed cabling pierced his skull, running back across his scalp in hissing cornrows. Eyes that were gimlet black, yet lit from within by the coldest light, stared out from a face that had known only bitter disappointment and had been cursed by inevitable betrayal. His mighty hammer Forgebreaker had been crafted by another, but had changed so profoundly from its original appearance that even had its original maker been alive to see it, He would no longer recognize the craft as his own. I'm going to throw a quick editor's note in here now that I'm going back through the video and putting it all together, because I've noticed a discrepancy, and it's why I don't like using secondary sources for my videos. Forgebreaker was originally made by Fulgrim, who is definitely still alive, but it had been gifted to Ferrus Manus, who is now dead. So I'm not sure if it was the author's mistake or the person who posted this excerpt online. When it says original maker, it should say original owner. Anyways, it was just something that was bothering me. It's neither here nor there. Moving on with the story. The Lord of Iron ends up playing several games of regicide with the Iron Warrior known as Hansu in an attempt to teach him a few lessons about warfare, and at one point he tells him that he can't let his emotions cloud his judgment, and that by forming personal attachments to things, people, and places, you are also forming weaknesses. Hansu, who knows the history of the Legion, reminds the Lord of Iron that during the heresy, he made decisions based on his emotions. Perturabo concedes this and admits that those were mistakes that he had learned from. Defeat is important. Nobody likes being beaten, but everyone needed to taste it from time to time. They play multiple games together, and Hansu loses every single one of them. No matter what he tries, his demonic Primarch rebukes him. The Lord of Iron asks him if he knows why he is failing, and Hansu states that it's because, first and foremost, he's up against a Primarch, one that had seized every possible advantage for himself, leaving Hansu with nothing to work with. Perturabo half agrees with his assessment, but tells him primarily it's because he's trying to fight like every other warsmith within the Legion, and not like himself. He needs to fight as if this is his chance to humble everyone who looked down on him. Hansu is confused by this and contests it, saying that he had just told him that fighting like that was a weakness. Perturabo tells him that it is, but only when you don't realize that's what you're doing. He resets the game and tells him that if he can't beat him this time, then the Lord of Iron was going to kill him. This battle is different. It's a void war, with its primary objective being taking a single planet. Hansu doesn't realize it at the time, but Perturabo had set up a scenario reflective of the battle that was soon to come in the 13th Black Crusade against Cadia. Hansu throws everything he has into it, making moves that don't seem to make sense, but serve to offset his opponent, ignoring strategic objectives to instead do as much damage as possible. Almost as if he was fighting not for victory, but for revenge. After several hours, he finally makes a move that he's been setting up to take Cadia, and Perturabo concedes defeat. He congratulates him and says that a real version of this battle is coming, and that they needed to prepare. I find this scene particularly interesting because it's reminiscent of Perturabo from before the Horus Heresy. It's a Primarch sitting across from one of his sons trying to teach him a valuable lesson. And honestly, it's kinda easy to forget that there's a full-blown demon sitting across from Hansu at the table. Just from this little exchange, it seems like after Perturabo ascended to demonhood, he managed to maintain his sanity. Just by reading this, he may have actually been onto something when he thought about enforcing order on chaos. Considering how good of a job they did with bringing the Lion back, and how Old Man Lion is basically a completely different character than his younger counterpart, he's a lot older and wiser, and he's all about forgiveness and stuff now, I would be really curious to see if they end up doing something like that with one of the traitor Primarchs. Not that I think that's actually going to happen, that's more just me thinking out loud, but it would be really interesting. In my closing thoughts, I want to really just quickly touch on when a lot of this was written and how Games Workshop tends to handle retcons. The story we examined in the first half of this video came from Index Astartes Volume 1 that was released in November of 2003. Around this time, the Iron Warriors were portrayed mostly as just what we would consider today as generic Chaos Space Marines. They still had their affinity for siege warfare, but the legions would be fleshed out a lot more over the next 2 decades. Hell, the Horus Heresy novel series that is still ongoing as of the time of this recording, it wouldn't even launch its first book until 3 years later. If you want a great book that really illustrates Games Workshop's early vision of the Iron Warriors, then you should read Storm of Iron, which came out in 2002. The Iron Warriors in that book are summoning demons left and right, doing all kinds of dark rituals, using demon engines, etc., etc. You don't really get a lot of the characteristic anti-chaos behavior that we commonly associate with them today. And I'll also just say, even if it's a bit outdated, Storm of Iron is quintessential Chaos Space Marine reading, and it's one of my favorite 40k books. I promise you'll have a good time with it. I fully believe that when the time comes that Perturabo does return to the setting, we will get a lot more insight into why he decided to become a demon. I don't think it will be a retcon. At at least not in the traditional sense. Games Workshop is really good with how they handle retcons, normally just adding a whole buttload of context to a previously established bit of lore, rather than outright saying it never happened. I honestly think a lot of other prominent fantasy franchises could learn something from Games Workshop, but that's a discussion for another video. But what are your thoughts? Do you like the fact that Perturabo is a demon? Does it make sense to you? If you were to re-examine his story, would there be anything that you would change? What do you think his motivation was? And do you ever think we'll see Perturabo return to the story proper? I know I personally would love to see some kind of interaction between him and Vashtor the Archifane, because out of all the demons that exist in Warhammer 40k's lore, I actually think those two might get along. Let me know all of your thoughts down in the comment section. As you know, I read pretty much every single one of them, and I love hearing what you guys think. Big thanks to everyone who supports the work that I do, and I will catch y'all in the next one.